you all who are here. My name is Colleen Stewart. I'm the communications coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance. This is our third Network Cafe in our 2023-2024 Network Cafe series. I want to just kind of introduce our organization a little bit before we get started. But as I do that, please continue to introduce yourself in the chat so we can all know each other and know where we're coming from, where we're calling in from. You'll also see the agenda in the chat as well, so you can start to take a look at that for today. A little bit about us. We are the New Hampshire Food Alliance, like I said, and we're a statewide network that engages and connects people dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in the Granite State. We host our network cafes, which this is one of them, on the first Friday of each month. And these are really a space for conversation and for learning about various food system topics, and really a place for our network partners to connect with each other. And we do all this work and more as a community outreach partner or program of the Sustainability Institute at UNH in Durham. And as a part of UNH, we always feel it's important to acknowledge that we share the university's dedication to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. We believe those four tenets are foundational values that are inextricably linked to achieving our core educational mission and embracing the many characteristics of our community members that make them uniquely themselves. And with that, and as part of the university's commitment to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, we believe it's important to continually acknowledge the hardships the Indigenous communities in our region have faced, as well as the positive impact they have in our community. We do this through the UNH Land, Water, and Life Acknowledgement, which I will read from now. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Leendakina, homeland, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. We also acknowledge the hardships that they continue to endure after the loss of unceded homelands, and champion the university's responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the Indigenous people who carry forward the tradition of their ancestors. Okay, so I want to turn you to our agenda really quickly. I'm going to put that in the chat again, just so folks can use it as a guide as we get to the meat of our presentation today in our Network Cafe. There are two things in there I want you just to look at. Our working agreements, which are linked in our agenda, as well as our desired outcomes for this specific Network Cafe today. Both of those things I hope will provide you with a good understanding of what we'll be doing and what we'll be talking about today, but also what our expectations are of ourselves and you as we spend this time together. So please feel free to take a look at those as you can. Okay. Before I pass the baton to our presenter for the day, I just wanted to share a little bit about kind of this overarching theme of what we're doing here for our Network Cafe series this year. As I mentioned, it is a part of a series, this Network Cafe today, and it's centered around a 4-volume report of very foundational food system data that was released recently, and the report is entitled, as you'll see on the slide there, A Regional Approach to Food System Resilience. That was released earlier this year. The report was released as part of work of the New England State Food System Planners Partnership, and this partnership consists of food system organization from each New England state, including New Hampshire Food Alliance, which we represent New Hampshire, obviously, as well as Food Solutions New England. And together, these organizations, they hired a team of researchers to produce this amazing, amazing report, really dense report. And it follows 4 specific areas of food systems to better understand the opportunities our region, New England, has to produce and consume more of our own food. I really made that sound super simple. It's definitely not, but it's really exciting data and information and a springboard for so much great work that all of our network partners are doing currently. So today we are diving into volume 2. Last month we did volume 1. Next month we'll do volume 3. Pretty self-explanatory there, but volume 2 is entitled Estimating Production for Regional Self-Reliance. And Christian Peters, he was the research team lead for this volume, and he's going to kind of guide us through that today. But I want to share a little bit about Christian, just so you all have an idea of what his background is and kind of what led him to be the research team lead for this volume. So Christian is, in his day job, is the research leader of the USDA Agricultural Research Service Food Systems Research Unit in Burlington, Vermont. That is a mouthful. He came to the USDA in 2021 to establish this new unit, the first at the ARS to focus on food systems. He was the perfect candidate for this research team lead of Volume 2 because of his studies of sustainability of food systems using computational modeling and through interdisciplinary research, including some of his best-known work developing a modeling framework for estimating land requirements of diets and human carrying capacity and an approach for mapping potential food sheds. Dr. Peters received his bachelor's in environmental sciences from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and his master's and PhD in soil and crop sciences from Cornell. So we asked Christian to share about the questions that were posed to this research team for Volume 2, just kind of really give an overview of that, but also to really share what they learned and kind of how those learnings will be applied to, again, our work here in the New Hampshire food systems. So Chris, please take it away.
Thank you, Colleen, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. I will start by talking about the research questions before I dig into any slides. We essentially had one question, which is, what is the region's biophysical capacity to produce its own food? And we looked at this in two ways, looking at it kind of historically, and I'll share that data in a minute, and then looking at what might potentially be possible. Those are the two ways we looked at this same question. Before I get into any of that, I do want to introduce who was on the team. So next slide, please. There were 16 researchers engaged in the project overall. So that's across all of the 4 volumes. And this particular team, the production team, was led by myself, and we also had 7 other members. So Brian Donahue, Laura Barley, Ramon Borges-Mendez, Ashley McCarthy, April McElwine, Sarah Schumann, Joshua Stoll, and Eric von Wetberg. And each of us brought different expertise to the table to contribute to the report that's in Volume 2. I'm going to focus really on 2 aspects of this report: the historic and the potential ability to rely on New England's land and fisheries for food. But if you want to see more details, of course, go to the report. Next slide, please. I thought I would start with a figure that's not actually in Volume 2. It's in one of the other volumes, but it's a nice orienting point. And that is this figure of agricultural and fishery sales. It's from 2017. So this is essentially, if you will, the dollar value of primary production of food in the region. And you can see from the pie chart that fisheries, of course, is a big piece of that. And then there are other pieces: dairy, greenhouse sales, vegetables, and so on. And as you might imagine, this doesn't necessarily match directly to how we spend on what we eat. And that's going to be a continuing theme as we go on here this afternoon. But I think it's a nice point of departure, because often this is maybe, at least from the producer's perspective, the first way they think about production, which is the dollar value of sales in any given year. Next slide, please. So how we approached this was this concept of self-reliance, which I want to define because I want to make sure you understand exactly what we mean here. Regional self-reliance in this case is not estimating how much food we actually eat from the region, because we don't have data on where food goes after it's produced to be able to estimate that. So what we did instead, and what is common in the literature, is to do a ratio of production to consumption, because we do have lots of historical data on production captured annually by the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And we also have data on food consumption. In that case, tabulated annually by USDA's Economic Research Service. So let me describe a bit about what you see in this table. We've got the major food groups. They're probably groups that you're familiar with if you've looked at the food pyramid, or what's now known as My Plate. And then across the top, we've got production, consumption, and mean RSR, which stands for regional self-reliance. It's just a percentage of production to consumption. Now the numbers. So the numbers here are all in pounds fresh weight of not so much food, but really agriculture or fisheries commodity. This is food in a really raw state. So for dairy, for example, it would be fluid milk. For the vegetables, it would be vegetables as they're harvested off the farm. And for anything like the protein category, which includes meats and fish products, it's food on the hoof, or as a whole fish, if you will. It's not exactly what you would eat. So that's important to bear in mind. On the consumption side, it's basically the same thing. It's what ERS calls the farm equivalent weight of these different food commodities. So that's important, because as you look at these numbers, you might think, wow, they look really large, and that's part of the reason that they look large. Now, across the 7 food groups we've got here, dairy, vegetables, fruits, proteins, grains, fats and oils, and sweeteners, you can see that overall, the region produces almost 21% of the equivalent that it consumes, but it's not evenly distributed across those food groups. There's a big contribution for dairy, big contribution for vegetables, and then, quite a bit smaller for the other food groups. And I say big relative to the Feeding New England sort of target of 30%. And this is kind of a reflection of the fact that the food system in the 21st century is specialized. There's a lot of regional specialization, and that's something that you're seeing here. And I want to dive into that a little bit deeper. So next slide, please. I'll show you 2 examples that give you a sense of how much specialization there is. So here we have a chart just of the vegetables food group broken down by vegetable subgroup. So if you're not familiar with these, the vegetable food group has 5 subgroups according to My Plate. And you can see here very clearly that the starchy one is the one that we have the highest RSR, and that's mostly potatoes, mostly New England potatoes that you see there, and the other ones are much smaller. So there's this theme here that if you look, kind of underneath the hood for any of these food groups, you're going to see that the contributions are very specific to what New England produces, depending on what fruit and vegetable crops or livestock products are grown widely in the region. So we'll look at one more example. Next slide, please. And that is the protein subgroup. And what you see here is that a little bit more distribution than in the vegetable subgroup. And we've got it broken down a little bit differently. It's kind of by major category of food within this food group. So seafood is the highest of the bunch at almost 32%. And then you can see in a downward trend, we've got eggs next, followed by lamb, then beef and veal, and then pork, turkey, and chicken are all very small, less than 1% of what we currently consume. Now, taking a step back, it's probably not surprising. This region is not known as a major producer of pork, chicken, or turkey. And if you're surprised at the beef and veal, that's largely contributed as a byproduct of the dairy industry, at least in New England's case. The seafood I'll pause on for a moment, because we did account for individual seafood items that New England produces beyond what it consumes. So we capped the contribution of any food group at 100%. You couldn't give more than 100%. So for something like scallops, for example, where New England produces much more than it consumes, we capped its contribution at 100%. And that shows you there's still more stories kind of on a commodity by commodity basis. Now, all of this is showing a slice in time, kind of a picture of where we stand now, based on the years 2010 to 2019, comparing production to consumption. So we wanted to look forward and explore the question of what would it take to get to 30% of RSR. So, not even getting to the point of what would it take if you wanted to go beyond 30%, but just to get to 30%. So I want to discuss how we did that and then talk you through some of what we found. The next slide, please. The starting point is actually our assumptions about what people eat. I'm going to reiterate just with one slide, kind of encapsulate what was covered on your last session, kind of the take-home point from that volume that's really important to this one. And that is, what did we assume about what people eat? The project had two diet scenarios, one which we called unchanged eating and the other which was called resilient eating, which I'll describe in a moment. The unchanged eating is essentially per capita consumption adjusted for losses and waste, and that's based on the US food supply data. So this is what's known as the USDA's loss-adjusted food availability system, which take estimates of the raw food supply, make some assumptions based on data that's been collected on loss through the food chain, and estimate how much you think people actually eat. And that's what you see here. So it's showing that unchanged eating is about 2,800 calories across these different food groups, and that it's distributed across, as we go around the pie here, grains in orange, meat, eggs, seafood, and nuts, which we refer to as the protein sources food group, in purple, then added fats, oils, and butter in kind of this gold color, and then sugars, dairy, vegetables, and fruit. That's what you see there. The biggest changes in resilient eating are, one, that it's a reduction in calories, about 2,300 calories as opposed to almost 2,800 calories per day. And the other change is that there's a mix, sort of a redistribution in what people eat, and it largely follows recommendations from MyPlate, which tends to increase vegetables and fruits. We have a reduction of sweeteners and added fats. The protein food group changes a little bit, reduces servings a little bit, but it largely changes which foods are providing those servings. And then grain stays fairly similar in total amount, but bigger as a percentage. And if you have questions about that later, happy to answer them. All right, next slide, please. So those diets were the starting input to the model that estimated what would it take to get to 30%. And that model is shown conceptually here in this flow diagram. And if you look at the upper left, you see a picture of MyPlate. That's representing our diet scenarios. So that was our starting point. And what we did from there as a team was determine what would our target regional self-reliance be for either food groups, or in some cases, if it was even food subgroups or individual food commodities, to try to target within the region. How much would we try to meet? And in some cases, it was above 30%. In some cases, it was below 30%, because we knew it wouldn't be possible to supply all of the foods at the same amount. So the model assigns those targets and then works out how much land is required. So it does that. We'll kind of talk moving left to right in this diagram. The first step shown in the first set of green boxes is which of that food is going to be supplied in the region and which is going to come from outside. Now, for some foods that aren't even produced in the region at all, like tropical fruits, they automatically fall in that lower box, which is food supplied from outside the region. And then the model calculates, based on the target RSR, that fraction would be supplied within the region, and then the rest goes into the bucket that's food supplied from outside the region. So that's just distributing what are we going to try to produce here. Now, to calculate how much land that would take, there's a number of steps that happen. The first step is to take those estimates of food consumption, which are in servings of food, and convert them to a weight basis, and to account for losses that happen. So that's where that box labeled food losses data comes into play. We converted this, pile of servings into actual servings of things like fluid milk, meat on the hoof, and so on, and fruits and vegetables at the farm gate. We then used some information on livestock feed requirements and took this bucket labeled crops and livestock requirements and converted it essentially into how much plant biomass do we need to produce all these foods. And then used data on crop yields to figure out, based on that plant biomass we need, how much land is required. I may be wondering, well, where do fisheries fall in all of this? And what we did, for the sake of argument, since we didn't have a similar model for estimating future potential fisheries, is we held it constant at what current landings were in the previous 10-year period. And that was the way to estimate land required. Now, you can go back and redo this as many times as you want. We did a lot of iterations in this in our research, which is why you see that line at the bottom. And lastly, if you're looking at that circle that says calories and servings, those are the two ways that we measured RSR for this purpose. Because, for the sake of understanding how many people we could feed, we were interested in some sort of nutritional measure of that. So we looked at both calories and servings, and I'll say more on that in a moment. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you about the scenarios that we examined on how might we get to 30%, because we looked at more than two. We looked at each of the two diets I presented, and we looked at a diet based on the current area of land, and then a hypothetical where we expanded the area of land to reach 30%. And we looked at it at two bases. We looked based on the 5 core food groups. So that would be grains, fruits, vegetables, dairy, and protein-rich foods. And then we looked at it based on total calories in the diet. You may be wondering, well, why did we choose those two? So we chose calories as one metric because it's a metric that, of course, we can measure in the same units for every food group. So we wanted to measure that. It's a good measure of total food in the diet. But because it varies, the contribution of different food groups vary, we thought, well, that might not be the best metric to look at this by food group. And we ended up deciding on the 5 core food groups because those are the ones that most, when you think of food, you think of those food groups and not necessarily some of the things that we add to foods when we're cooking, like oils or sweeteners. So that's where we focused. Now, talking through these numbers here, our goal was to look at these 5 different scenarios, and I'll start by describing the reference. The reference in this case is similar to, but a little bit different from, the data I shared earlier on the regional self-reliance of the whole region based on historical data. The reference is just a little bit different. It's based on a single year. So we used 2019 as our reference year. And while the data I shared earlier are on the basis of weight, the wet weight of foods or the fresh weight of foods, these are based on servings. So the numbers don't come out to be exactly the same. Now, the reason we wanted the reference is that that's our target starting point, and then we're working towards 30% from there. So our 4 scenarios that are essentially aspirational scenarios, the unchanged eating pathway A and B, which is current land versus trying to reach 30%, and the resilient eating pathways A and B, current land versus reaching 30%, are the 4 aspirational scenarios. And you can see that we couldn't quite reach 30% on the current footprint of land, so we had to expand. That's what you see in that column with the 5 core food groups by servings. You'll notice that the total calories in the diet, we never met 30%. And that's in part because the foods that are very calorie dense were not produced at as high a level. So it kind of draws down the average in terms of calories. We could discuss that later if you want. Next slide, please. Can we advance the slide, please?
Sorry, for some reason it's not working. Let me try to reboot the slides here.
I've had that problem too before.
Okay, should be up in just a second. Oops. How's that? Oops, sorry.
There we go.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So before we look at what land it would take, I want to break this down for you by food group, because what I showed you before were just the overall RSR numbers. And it's important to understand what assumptions we made about targeting each food group, because when we developed the RSR targets, we began from the starting point of the reference. Where are we now? And the idea was, well, we wanted to increase overall self-reliance, but try to also increase the diversity of foods and try to more evenly spread them out than they are currently. Because you can see from the reference that dairy and vegetables have a large contribution, but the contributions of the other groups are smaller. So in essence, we were aiming for about 10% RSR for grains and protein-rich foods, about 50% for dairy and vegetables, and about 30% for fruit, the average of which would get us to 30% of calories, or sorry, 30% of servings. And in running this model with multiple iterations, we didn't quite get there, but that at least gives you the thinking behind where we landed. And you can see that across these scenarios, the largest contributions from dairy, next largest is from vegetables, the third was fruit, then grains, then protein-rich foods of those 5 food groups. We didn't change sweeteners at all, and fats and oils varied really as a function of the production of feed grains to support the livestock that are assumed to be raised in the region, because soybean is providing the oil contribution to the diet. So what you're seeing in essence across these scenarios is greater self-reliance and a greater diversity of foods to meet that self-reliance. Next slide, please. So to the kind of the punchline that we were aiming at in this second portion of the work, looking at what it would take to get to 30%, we've got it here in this figure, and I'll talk you through it. We'll start with the rectangle on the top, which is labeled Land and Agriculture 2017, and then get to the bottom. The one on the top is showing you how land was used according to 2 data sets. So one is the Census of Agriculture, which reports land use on farms on about a 5-year basis. And the other is something known as the Major Land Uses data set, which is compiled by Economic Research Service using a whole range of data sets. It's meant to cover all land in the United States. And it brings into play some data on land use that occurs off of farms. And you'll see why that's important in a moment. So if we talk through these boxes, you can see that in 2017, most of our cleared agricultural land was in some kind of perennial cover. So we've got perennial forages, which would largely be hay crops, and that's about 760,000 acres. And there's a lot of land that's in pasture. So we've got permanent pasture, which is on farms. It's not considered arable land or tillable land, and that's almost 300,000 acres. And there's this other pool of pasture, which is called pasture cover ungrazed. And that is this additional pasture land that is tracked by other data sources, not the Census of Agriculture, but other sources of land cover data that are collected by the federal government. And that's about 400,000 acres. We don't know exactly how that land is used or where it falls, but it's land and grassy cover that isn't mown for hay. And that's how much there is. The rest of it is other use categories. So we've got feed crops, which would include things like corn silage. We've got idle crop land, which is land that could be cropped, but but isn't. That's about 160,000 acres. Fruits and vegetables occupying about 70,000 and almost 100,000 acres. And then land that's in crop failure, fallow, or non-food crops, which is about also about 70,000 acres, and then a small amount in grains. That last box in white, the dotted line that says additional cleared land, that's the additional amount of land that would be needed to get to 30% according to the resilient diet and given the RSR targets that I shared before. So how would land be used to meet 30%? Well, there's a few changes. First of all, we're adding this almost 600,000 acres. And the other thing you'll see here is that there's a redistribution. There would still be land in perennial forages, and there will be more of it than there is now. Be about the same area in permanent pasture cover, but all of it would be used for grazing. And then you see increases in these other categories. Feed crops increases to over 300,000 acres. Vegetables and fruits each more than double in terms of the land area. Grains used for food, over 100,000 acres. Idle crop land actually decreases. We assume that we could essentially increase the percentage of land that was used for active farming. And then crop failure, fallow, and non-food crops goes up a little bit because there would still be some crop failure as you expand the land that's in agriculture. So what does that mean kind of at the take-home message? It means using 400,000 acres of existing underused cropland and pasture and bringing almost 600,000 of new cropland into production in these different types of uses. And that's a big change. I'm sure many of you on the call are probably familiar with the land use history of the region. There was once much more land in cropland and pasture, even as early as the middle of the 20th century. And land has gone back to forest or been developed in that time. So it raises this question, lots of questions about how that might happen. And that's where our work stopped. Our task was to estimate what would it take, knowing that there would be more questions to follow. And I think with that, we can segue into what questions you might have for me today. And thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. That was
You're welcome.
Super informative. I know I was writing a bunch of notes down and learning a number of things myself. I'm going to make my way over to our questions. And feel free, everyone, as we're discussing and kind of answering these questions and more questions pop up, just feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure to try to cover them all. So we'll first start with Jessica's question. How do or don't these current resiliency estimates account for food supply and consumption that doesn't go through the economic system? For example, home gardens, backyard flocks for eggs and or meat, etc.
The short answer is they don't. They don't include that. And I want to say a bit more about why. Because we did talk about this as a team quite a bit. And at the end, we decided we needed to use a consistent sort of baseline data source. So we used the loss adjusted food supply. Now, that said, we talked about, well, where else might this be captured? That consumption, it would be captured in other data sources, or at least it could in theory be captured in other data sources, like the What We Eat in America survey that has been done now it's in 2-year cycles since the early 2000s. But that survey doesn't ask whether or not people, how they acquired the food. They just ask what they ate. So it would be included in their estimate of intake, but it doesn't tell you how much. So we concluded that this was a gap area that in the future would be good to try to nail down. We did talk a bit about, well, where might you get information on, for example, game which is caught, and we could get that, but we didn't have data on home gardens to include that in any way that we felt was as robust as the other data that we had. So it's a gap.
Great. And I know UNH Cooperative Extension, I think, is also interested in that question and finding out more about that gap of information. Next, we'll go to Chelsea's question. I wonder how this model would change if using the healthy eating plate recommendations versus the My Plate recommendations. Have you considered looking at other evidence-based eating recommendations?
We did consider it at the point at which we were making decisions. Well, not our team, but the diet team was making decisions about how to frame the diet, and we ended up settling on two. I don't know if Brian Donahue discussed this on his last on the last Network Cafe, but there is a challenge of how many scenarios can you absorb and model. You certainly could model an additional type of scenario that wouldn't be difficult, but we all had to come to agreement in this complicated project, so we settled on the two. Now, that said, if we were to look at it was the healthy eating plate. Did I get that correct? Is that Harvard's plate, or what's the provenance?
Yeah, that's the Harvard Nutrition Department eating plate. And I'm just curious because the USDA My Plate kind of relies more heavily on animal source foods, meat and dairy, than the healthy eating plate. And those also require more land use. So I'm just curious, like, if that would have an impact on kind of the model overall.
It would. I will offer a sort of a succinct explanation, and then maybe there will be more in the subsequent questions. So it would indeed impact the land that would be required by having a more plant-based diet in terms of those protein sources. I will say that the resilient diet, it did become more plant-based than the current eating pattern in a couple of ways. We kept consumption of dairy the same, even though My Plate recommends a higher amount from that food group, in part because consumption trends had been pretty flat for that food group for a long time. So that was the decision of the diet team. Within the protein sources food group, moving to My Plate, if you just meet the servings from that are required, that inherently brings down the total amount of protein sourced foods in the diet. So that was happening behind the scenes. Then we met the requirements for additional servings of legumes. So those changes ended up inherently reducing the amount of animal products, meat products, in the resilient diet. But yes, if you looked at different scenarios that had wider variation in meat, that would make a big difference because it's the most land-hungry food group, if you will.
Got it. Very dynamic and challenging to kind of tackle from all the angles. Let's move on to Juliana's question is next. Do any diets or scenarios account for food waste beyond the farm stage of the food supply chain? Did any analysis consider how reducing food waste, estimated at 30 to 40% nationally, might help reach goals?
We did not consider scenarios of reduced food waste, but we did consider how much food waste there is past the farm stage. And we did that using ERS's estimates from the loss adjusted food supply. They look at 3 different stages of food loss. So loss that occurs from the farm to whatever the next point in the supply chain is. They call that primary to retail food loss. So that would be things like loss that happens getting produce to a grocery store, for example. And then there's retail level loss, which accounts for loss, in this case, really in supermarkets. That's their frame of reference. And they did a survey based on that type of middle of the supply chain business. And then the third level is consumer level loss, which includes plate waste plus the loss of inedible portions. And the plate waste fraction is, for many foods, is actually a pretty large share. Plate waste and other waste that occurs in the house. It could be spoilage, doesn't have to just be plate waste. So we use their numbers directly, but you could from there estimate, well, what if they were reduced, and how much land would that save in essence? We didn't do that, but it certainly could be done for future work.
Great. Next question was from Alex. What was the rough percentage of food waste in the model? I don't know.
Yeah, gosh, it's hard to give a general estimate because it varies so much from food to food. I will give you a couple that I remember off the top of my head, just as examples. So for I don't have an example in my head of a low value. I have one in my head of a high value. So I think I'll take that back. They range quite a lot. In the retail segment, it can be from the single digits in terms of percent food loss to, for foods like certain greens, it can be over 50%, just at that level. And then for the consumer level, it does vary between, I think the consumer level waste was between 10 and 30%, something like that. And then, there's a lot of variation within food groups. So it's something that I don't want to, I could give you an estimate if I went back to the model and tell you how much happens from farm to fork, but it's tricky because some of these estimates of losses aren't true losses. Some of them are really changes in weight that might be the loss of water evaporating from something, and you still have the same amount of product, basically. In some cases, it's removable of inedible portions. So is that waste or is that a change in its form? It's tricky to summarize in a general way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully, Alex, that helped answer your question. Next, we'll go. The questions are still flying in, which is great. Still got a list ahead of us. Next, we'll go to Heather's question. Are you able to make the model account for the fact that not all acres of land are equally productive?
The short answer is not yet. We did consider that in a very coarse way, which is within the model, we've got land that's divided up between arable and non-arable. So the model doesn't assume that you're going to bring any land that's in pasture cover into production. But that's a very blunt instrument. So looking ahead to ways that could be done would be using tools like one, for example, is the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, which is another USDA product based on soils data from the Soil Survey, and which has an index for different major crops like corn. And that could be used to then scale productivity on different types of land. Problem is that it's not necessarily known how well that reflects the yield of some other crop. If not corn, you're actually producing vegetables. Well, is that a good indicator or not? So there's a lot of room for doing a more finely detailed analysis, particularly for crops where there are very specific climatic requirements. I'm thinking of the expansion of land for I was going to say vegetables first, but I think it's even harder for fruits. Is the growing season long enough? Is there a problem with low winter temperatures, things of that nature? So while we have an estimate from this study, there's definitely room for refining it. Another thing I'll say is that in the additional land, that's 600,000 acres, we didn't look at scenarios that included expanding beyond the area of prime farmland that the region has, prime farmland soils that are available but currently under some other cover. So that would mean they could be under woodland or shrub cover, or something other than cropland or pasture. Or they could be under pasture for that matter. They could be brought into active cropping.
Right. And I'm personally someone who's super visual. I think going through your presentation and kind of lumping together the 400,000 acres that are not currently being productive, but they are in pasture, and this kind of 600,000 that would need to be more developed, totaling 1 million. I just did a quick Google of how many acres are in the state of New Hampshire, and there's about 6 million. So just for folks, as a visual, we're talking about 1 million acres across New England, and kind of gives you an idea of what kind of scale we're talking about there. I know there's a couple more questions specific to kind of land management, things like that. So let's see, I believe we're on Talia's question right? Does the estimated land requirements take into account crop rotations and seasons when certain land areas need to rest for optimal soil health, which I know you started to touch upon a little bit?
It does a little bit, but let me unpack that. So it does in the sense that we did keep a certain amount of land in that fallow and crop failure box. We did essentially allow that to increase proportionally, so that if there's land in fallow on a regular basis and we bring more land into production, it's going to be a somewhat larger amount in fallow. But again, that's a very rough way to account for something that you can't account for without having rotations built into the model. Now, I'm going to go down a short rabbit hole because there's a new data product that came out literally in the past couple of months that I haven't even had a chance to work with that might enable this type of analysis more easily. I don't even remember its name, but it works with data from the cropland data layer, which is spatial data that USDA, National Ag Statistics Service, produces based on this satellite data of land cover, and they break it down by crop. Well, this new data set looks at crop sequences. So it's getting you towards crop rotation. So you could look at, well, what patterns exist here? Problem is, when you're looking ahead to what might the rotations be, you're adding this level of complexity that would take kind of another modeling exercise to do. Like, for example, how much, if you're producing vegetables, how much land do you need to have in fallow or rotated with another crop for, to support the production systems that we have in New England? And that's an excellent question to delve into, and to feel more confident in how much land would be required. That's a road to go down. But for now, all I can say is that we did account for the fact that we need a little bit more land in those non-productive categories, but translating that into crop rotations would be another step. I did take some solace in the fact that we still have a land base that's largely in, according to the numbers, largely in perennial crops. So, do you think that there's room for building or using existing rotations and being able to do that within the numbers that we shared?
Great. Yeah, I think as that piece of technology kind of continues to roll out, I think that would be something that a lot of us on this call might be interested in looking for. The next question is kind of for you personally, Christian. John asked, Christian, what are your biggest lessons from looking at land dynamics in this way? And what does it mean for all of us as we work to shift to a resilient and equitable system?
Give me a moment to think on that.
Sure.
I think that there's a few things. I mean, one, I wasn't surprised that we couldn't come up with a scenario that meant 30% given the diets that we had in the land footprint. I think that for me, the biggest thing was probably looking at the historical data, which I didn't share on land use. There is a diagram in the volume 2 report. So for those interested, you can go back. We've got a chart on land use going back, I think, to about 1945. So you can see the percentage of change. I mean, it's about 75% reduction in land and cropland and pasture in that time period. So I look at that two ways. I mean, on the one hand, there's a history of using land for that purpose. But on the other hand, if you look at the last 30 years, there's not much movement. It's pretty much stable. And the idea that you might be able to bring land into production, to me, wasn't a surprise, but it did make me think, what is the possibility of doing that? And what are the consequences of doing that? It was kind of a moment that gave me great pause to think about what would the potential impacts be. Mm-hmm. And I think I was maybe a bit surprised by how, in looking at the regional self-reliance of individual products, how widely it varies from product to product, how large it can be and how small it can be. I knew specialization was part of the food supply, but it became really apparent for this region as I looked at the data.
Got it. Yeah, that's great insight. We We want to make sure that we get to questions. I know there's been a number of comments that people have been writing into the chat as well. So kind of final call for a question or two before we need to end it in the next few minutes. But in the meantime, there are a couple of comments, and we are being joined by Representative Peter Bixby today. I didn't know if you wanted to hop on, unmute yourself, and I know you've got a question and a comment potentially.
Sure. So one of the things I've been working on for the last few years is slaughter facilities in New Hampshire and the lack thereof. And one of the things that this model seems to suggest is that if we're going to need to utilize more lower value land in order to get to what the total acreage we need in order to supply that 30%. And that would most likely be used by grazing, since that's the best use for a lower value land. But given that it's extremely hard at this point to get your animals to slaughter, I think people would be hesitant to actually invest in that unless we had better more slaughter facilities and processing facilities.
If that is a question that I'm quite familiar with, having worked on a project before I came to USDA on that question in New York and New England about capacity of, we were looking specifically at estimating what the capacity was and how it varied around a 7-state region. So New York State plus New England. And I think it's a nice example of a question that would be true for other foods, beyond meat, because for, any of the perishable commodities, or even some of the fairly unperishable commodities like storable vegetables and fruits like apples or cabbages, there's infrastructure that's required in the middle of the supply chain to make any of this feasible, even if it was economically viable, which is why this particular volume was focused on essentially the primary biological capacity to produce food, but wanting to remind people that we need to think about this other piece, is how does it actually get all the way to a point of sale, which would include slaughter. And if you're interested in any of the research that we've got on that, I'm happy to share the links to the prior work. And Caitlin and Colleen, if that's helpful to know about, I could share it with you, and then you can distribute it to the network because it may be of interest to others.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I also, it's not directly related, but it's pretty related in a larger sense. Like our next Network Cafe will be kind of about these industries and these sectors that need to grow in that middle area between these two scenarios that we've talked about today and in our last cafe as well. So stay tuned for that next month.
Awesome. Thanks for that. We've just got a couple minutes left, and one more comment from Donna. And maybe I'll read the comment, and then Donna, if you have any kind of a question as a follow-up, we could do that, or we could move on from there. So she said, dairy production relies on overproduction and export out of the region. Restructuring of land used for dairy to grass-based dairy, less reliance on imported grains, soy, etc. This is an area that needs more study, less export of fluid milk out of the region. So Donna, just an invitation if you want to comment any more on that, or if you have a question for Christian on this subject.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
My earplugs are a little stuffy. I guess I'm just concerned about the way sometimes that statistics look at land and classify land. I was a soil scientist once upon a time, so quite familiar with all of that. But I think there's opportunity in terms of available land if we look at our resources a little bit differently. This gets into the whole small scale farms. I currently farm on what would be considered poor land. We have sheep, but I have eked out, a certain soil type of 2 acres that I could produce. Well, I produce organic produce and market that. So I'm just saying that sometimes the data can not really provide as positive an outlook on the opportunities that really are there. That's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a moment to comment on that, Caitlin?
Yeah, if you want to take a moment and then we'll wrap up.
I just wanted to add, it's a detail that I didn't have time to share, but in the livestock feed requirements in the modeling, we used data from some prior work, which was mostly based on sort of typical contemporary feeding practices. One exception to that is we had some data from prior work on grass-finished beef that we did incorporate because a lot of the available land is pasture land, of course. So the model behind the scenes part of that increase of RSR for protein is additional meat, and that additional meat is largely grass-fed meat.
Right.
That's how it's been calculated. And I think there's lots of room for improvement of that type by collecting more data on alternative production systems. That's it. Thanks for the chance to respond.
Of course. And with that, I'll take it over to Colleen to have us wrap up.
Yeah. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you so much, Christian, for being here and providing us such a great window into your work and the work of that team. Anyone whose questions didn't get answered in the chat, we'll do our best to get those answers out to you. Before you all head out, please take our Network Cafe evaluation. It really helps us make sure that these cafes are as useful and impactful as possible. I also hope that you'll all see us in December and share that registration with friends and colleagues who are interested in, like I said, that kind of middle of the supply chain sector development that we'll need to reach this 30%. So again, thank you, Christian. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next month.